Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our tutorial series on World in Flames Collector's Edition. Today we're going to talk about aircraft carriers, and this topic was originally included as part of the naval combat episode that I'm working on. But naval combat is one of the more complex subsystems within World in Flames. And so the episode, I'm trying to keep the naval combat episode to a reasonable length for everyone. And I thought it would help if I went ahead and just broke out a discussion on the aircraft carrier mechanics into its own separate episode. And this will allow me to get into aircraft carriers in a little more detail, and we won't be taking up as much time in the naval combat episode discussing what you need to know in order to conduct naval combat with aircraft carriers. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at how WIF handles aircraft carriers. In today's episode, I'm going to discuss the WIF Classic aircraft carrier rules, which is how most of the tutorial series has been set up thus far. For the most part, we've covered just the classic version of the rules to allow players that are only playing classic to go ahead and get what they need out of it. I'm going to be going through all of the optional rules at the end of the series. So those of you who are interested in playing the deluxe version will be able to see how all of those rules work. But today, since we're here, I'm going to, after I go through the WIF Classic version of the aircraft carrier rules, I'm going to also discuss how the deluxe version handles that, just to give everybody kind of an easy comparison and contrast to how each one handles, and let you decide which one you prefer. I know I have my preferred method, and we can talk about that at the end of the video. So to get started, you can identify aircraft carriers by the colored box around their factor in the lower right-hand corner of the ship counter. The first thing to keep in mind is that aircraft carriers are in fact a naval unit, so they move and they will fight under all the naval rules. However, instead of having a shore bombardment value, they have what's called an air component value, and that's again indicated by a colored box. Now, the color of the box makes no difference when you're playing the classic version of the game. You simply know that this colored box is going to tell you basically how many air factors that the carrier has, because these aircraft carriers, not only do they move and fight like ships, you can see the USS Lexington here has a surface combat value of 3, so it can participate in a surface naval combat just like a battleship or a cruiser. But aircraft carriers also have the ability to fly air missions just as if it were an air unit. And that's where things start to get a little tricky. So carrier planes, and basically when this piece decides to fly a mission using the air component, it becomes, for all practical purposes, you can kind of consider it as an actual air unit at that point. And it can fly missions the same manner that any other air unit can do. And like fighters, it can fly a mission either as a fighter or a bomber, which means every time you fly this as an air unit on an air mission, you're going to have to allocate the air component factors into air-to-air and air-to-sea factors. So, as an example, if I were to fly this aircraft carrier on an air mission as a fighter to maybe intercept enemy aircraft, I could choose to make these 4 factors air-to-air factors, and it would have an air-to-air factor of 4 and an air-to-sea value of 0. Conversely, if I were going to go attack some enemy ships, I could choose to fly this as a bomber, and I could put all 4 factors into the air-to-sea value. So it would have an air-to-air value of 0, and it would have an air-to-sea value of 4. And I can do any combination of that. I could send this up with an air-to-air value of 2, which would allow me to have up to 2 air-to-sea factors. Now, you are not just limited to flying missions as fighters to intercept or escort, or flying naval air missions to attack enemy shipping. You can also fly you can fly ground strike missions, you can fly ground support missions. In that case, your tactical factors, which is what aircraft use when they're trying to affect land combat and land units via airstrikes or ground strikes and ground support, is going to be half of whatever the naval air factors are in this. So going back to the example of flying this as a pure bomber, if you will, with 0 air-to-air and 4 air-to-sea factors, the 4 air-to-sea factors would mean it would have a tactical factor of 2, which would be used to either for ground support missions or as a ground strike aircraft. Also, they can even perform strategic bombardment missions and bomb factories. In that case, their strategic factors are 1/10 of whatever allocated air-to-sea factors you have. Just like other air units, carriers, when flying air missions, have a range. That range is equal to the number of air factors of the air component on the carrier. So in this case, the USS Lexington has a range of 4, allowing it to fly from, if it's flying an inland mission or a mission against a land hex, you simply start counting the range from any C dot that is in the carrier's C zone where it's located. So it would be, it would cost 2 range in order to conduct an airstrike against Yap. If we zoom out a little bit here, you can see if we slide over closer to the Philippines, this Bismarck Sea area is defined by the borders up here. I'm in the 3 box, for example. I have a range of 4. We're on the Pacific maps, which means each hex consumes 2 range factors for all aircraft. The Lexington could fly an air mission against Manila here by starting in this C dot and going 2-4 to reach Manila. And then it would return to the carrier when it was completed with its air mission. Now, the Japanese carriers have a different range than everybody else. They actually get a range of 2 plus whatever their factor is. So in this case, the Ryuho, who only has an air component of 2, still has a range of 4. And if we look at the, who do we have over here? If we look at the Kaga here in truck with 4 air factors, the range that the Kaga has is actually 6. So the Japanese have basically a 2 range advantage over all other carrier aircraft. Now, in order to fly a mission, the aircraft carrier must be in one of the sections of a sea box. You cannot fly an air mission from port, even if you're trying to intercept enemy bombers making a port attack on that port. So carriers in port cannot use their air component. You must be out at sea in one of the sea boxes in order to fly your air missions. Now, when you fly an air mission, after the aircraft completes its mission, you will return it to the sea box it came from, and you will turn the carrier face down. And that's because in order to fly a mission, not only do you have to be in a sea box, but you also have to be face up. Now, if this aircraft carrier were to be involved in a naval combat in the future, even though it's face down, it would still be able to fly its aircraft in a naval combat. So aircraft carriers are always able to take part in a naval combat and fly their air component even when they're face down. Also, you may conduct a port attack against any port so long as that port is on the sea zone that the carrier is in. Range does not matter in that case. And I don't know if there is a good example over here in the Pacific or not. I don't think so. Some of the, since you have to count from a C dot, there may be an instance where you have a port that's more than, in the case of Lexington, more than 2 hexes from any C dot, but it's still on the C zone. That would not prevent Lexington from launching a port strike against that hex, but that's the only type of air mission that it could launch against the hex. Now, if the aircraft carrier, when it's flying as an air unit, is aborted from an air combat, you would simply return it immediately to the section of the sea box it flew from, and you would turn it face down. If, however, the carrier suffered, the air component of the carrier was destroyed during the air combat or perhaps during an anti-aircraft role, you would place one of these no plane markers on the carrier, denoting that it is now incapable of flying any more air missions until it is repaired. At the end of the combat, that carrier would then return to base, and after successfully returning to base, you would place it into the repair pool, where it would take 2 turns to be repaired, and you would have to spend the first cycle cost, in this case 2 build points, in order to conduct that repair. That's basically all the rules that cover aircraft carriers in Classic. And you can see it's a little wonky, I think, in the fact that you're going to have to remember how exactly you're splitting up these air component factors every single mission you fly. You've got this no planes marker when the air component is shot down. And because of that, I'd like to show you how Deluxe handles this with the carrier plane option, which is option 45. It always bothered me how WIF handled aircraft carrier units back when I was playing 4th and 5th edition. And I said, boy, they really need to separate the air component from the actual ship itself. And apparently I wasn't the only one who felt that way, because when the Ships in Flames expansion for 5th edition was released, we were suddenly introduced to aircraft carrier planes, or carrier planes, which do precisely that. They now split the air component from the ship itself. So if you are using the Ships in Flames expansion, which I highly recommend, and you're using the carrier plane option, again, which is one that I strongly recommend, now the aircraft carrier unit represents just the ship itself, and this playing piece no longer flies the actual air missions. Instead, you will need to base a carrier plane counter on that aircraft carrier, and it is the carrier plane that then conducts all of the air missions. Now, this is where the color of the air component comes into play. Instead of simply being the air component number of factors, this is now considered the carrier plane class, and every carrier plane you will see also has a colored box on the counter representing its class. You may only base an aircraft on a carrier if the carrier plane's class is equal to or less than the aircraft carrier's capability. Now, the one exception to that is you can place any one unit on that carrier. However, if the carrier plane's class size exceeds what the carrier can handle, you cannot fly any missions from that carrier, and you can only base, and I guess either embark or debark would be the proper terminology, that carrier plane from that carrier whenever the carrier is in port. So you can basically use it to transport a carrier plane from one port to another port. So it really doesn't do you any good. And in practical terms, you're really only going to want carrier planes on carriers if their class is smaller than what the aircraft carrier can handle. So in this instance, you can see the carrier planes come in a variety of aircraft with different factors, both air to sea, and in some cases tactical factors, as well as different ranges. So everything you need is right here on the counter. It eliminates all of the bookkeeping that's associated with flying this as an air unit in the Classic game. And furthermore, it provides a lot more variety in what you can do with your carriers. Now, here's an example of a Japanese carrier plane, and you can see the Ryujo here has a carrier class of 2. This carrier plane is a carrier class 3, so it would not be able to fit onto the Ryujo and fly any air missions. However, it could fit easily onto Kaga. So you simply place the carrier plane unit on top of the aircraft carrier to indicate that that is the carrier on which it is based. And when necessary, you simply remove the carrier plane. It flies its mission. At the completion of the mission, it will return to the carrier and go face down. And in all other respects, this carrier plane unit will basically stand in for the carrier that you were using to fly any air missions. To me, it's a much more streamlined method. And yes, it adds extra counters, and I understand there is a cost associated with getting ships in flames. So it's there are a couple of valid reasons for not playing the deluxe version of Whiff. I understand that. However, I do think in this case that it is more than worth the cost, as well as the additional number of pieces that you're going to have to deal with, because it does make gameplay run a lot smoother. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the details about how carrier planes work until I get to the optional episode where we talk about that, but I wanted to kind of show you how just basically the difference between Deluxe and Whiff Classic when it comes to how aircraft carriers are handled. If you go the classic route, you're going to end up having this one playing piece do double duty, and you're going to have to, because you've got the ability to swap these air component factors around to various ratings, whether it's air to air or air to sea or tactical, you're going to have to note that somehow. You're going to be using the no planes markers when appropriate. It just seems to me that well, personally, I really prefer using the carrier planes. And there are a couple of other reasons I like the carrier planes, but I won't get into that today because this one's starting to push the upper limit of how long I'd like to keep these episodes. But we'll definitely talk about that in the future, and we'll get into all of the rest of the rules that cover these carrier planes when we talk about the optional rules. But it's not that much, and I think for what little rules overhead they add, they bring a lot to the gaming experience. So that's going to cover it for aircraft carriers. I think you now know enough of what you need to know in order to be able to understand and follow the naval combat rules as it pertains to naval air combat and how aircraft carriers work. So next up, we will be diving right into the naval combat. And again, I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can, but it will probably be one of the longer tutorial episodes simply because of how much material we're going to have to cover. So thanks for watching today. If you enjoyed this and like to see more content, don't forget to click like and subscribe if you haven't already. Take care, and we'll see you next time.